Police accused Big Shaq of trespassing at his own house. But what followed wasn't outrage. It was revelation. Behind locked doors, fake deeds, and smiling neighbors lay a plan to erase more than property. And when Big Shaq answered, it wasn't with fists. It was with a truth so sharp, it cracked the silence of an entire neighborhood. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun poured across the smooth pavement of Whitwood Estates, a community so exclusive, even the breeze seemed pre-screened before entering. Lush, tailored hedges stood like silent guards along the perimeter, and the iron gates whispered open at the approach of Shaquille O'Neal's custom black SUV. The tires glided in silently. He'd been gone only 3 days, flown out to host a youth camp in Miami. Nothing about the house had changed physically, and yet everything felt different. Shaq lowered his sunglasses, eyes narrowing as the gates clanged shut behind him. He had pulled in 1,000 times before, but this time the click behind him felt more like a lock than a welcome. His house, his sanctuary rose ahead, tall and proud, but something about its posture felt off, like it was holding its breath. He parked in the curved driveway. The Georgia heat kissed the side mirrors. It was quiet. No birds, no distant bark of neighbor dogs, not even the chirp of a lawnmower down the road. Stillness that wasn't peaceful. It was watched. Shaq stepped out, heavy frame moving, with practiced ease. His presence usually drew smiles from neighbors, who knew the man behind the legend. But today, the windows were curtained. The porch across the street, where old man Leroy used to wave his newspaper and yell jokes, sat empty. Curtains fluttered behind glass like eyes hiding. The moment he reached for his front door, he stopped. There, embedded just under the security light, was a camera, not his. Sleek, black, unblinking. He bent closer. The make wasn't one he recognized. His own system, a custom set installed years ago, didn't use that hardware. It wasn't just a replacement. It was a complete override. He stepped back slowly. His thumb hovered over his phone screen as he opened his home app. The usual camera feeds were dead, all of them offline. The garage sensors, offline. The door unlock, denied. An error message blinked in red. No authorization. For the first time in years, Shaq felt outside, not just physically. He wasn't locked out of a house. He was being pushed out of a life he built. Quietly, carefully, without notice. He rang the bell, his own bell. No answer. He knocked. Nothing. He circled around to the backyard, thinking maybe the power went out. Maybe the app was glitching. Maybe there was a reason. There's always a reason. But when he got there, he found the fence latch had been replaced. An industrial-grade smart lock blinked red when he touched it. The camera above it whirred mechanically and followed his face. It clicked in his bones then. Not the kind of click you hear, but the kind that lands in your chest when you know. Someone didn't just hijack his system. They were watching him, tracking him, and they weren't trying to hide it anymore. He stood back and looked up at the roofline. 3 more cameras, none of them familiar, all pointed inward. Who were they for? Not burglars, not strangers. They weren't protecting the home. They were watching him inside it. Suddenly, a slow hum rolled across the lawn. A white security vehicle. One of those private types, with the gold logo that made it look official, but wasn't, rounded the corner, and stopped at the edge of his driveway. 2 men stepped out, slim, pale, vests with radios strapped to their shoulders. One of them tilted his head. "Can we help you, sir?" Shaq turned toward them, stunned for a moment by the word, "Sir." Not Shaq, not Mr. O'Neal, just, "Sir." Detached, as if they didn't know whose name was etched on the basketball court inside that very home. "This is my house," Shaq said evenly, gesturing. "I live here." The first guard nodded slowly, pulling out a tablet. "Can I see some ID?" Shaq blinked. "You serious?" "We've had reports," the second one added, "of a large male matching your description seen walking the property." Shaq stared, the statement echoing too absurdly to comprehend. A large male matching your description. He wanted to laugh, but the tone in their voices was too flat for comedy. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal," he said, voice low. "This is my house." The first guard didn't blink. "Sir, that doesn't exempt you from protocol." Shaq pulled out his wallet, held up his license. The first guard didn't even take it, just scanned it with a tablet scanner. The second one looked him up and down, then glanced at the house. "We're going to have to call this in," he said. "You think I'm breaking into my own home?" Shaq asked, not angry, confused. Like someone waking up inside a dream that was turning sharp at the edges. "It's just standard until we get verification," one said. He stood there, towering over them, every inch of him calm and controlled, not because he wasn't rattled, but because he couldn't afford not to be. They weren't asking him to leave. Not exactly. They weren't drawing guns. But the weight of threat hung between the words, the kind that doesn't need shouting, the kind that lingers. He stepped back, hands raised slightly, not because he had to, but because that's how black men live longer in America. Even when you're Big Shaq. Even when you've built your life brick by brick. As they radioed in, Shaq looked around again. And that's when he realized, it wasn't just the security guards. A few doors down, a neighbor was watching from her window, phone in hand. Another stood behind their gate, expression unreadable. The mailman across the street slowed his steps, eyes darting. He wasn't just unwelcome, he was suspect. Eventually confirmation came from somewhere in the ether. The guards murmured into radios. One gave a short nod. "You're good, Mr. O'Neal," one said finally. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Shaq didn't respond. He walked past them, unlocked the front door with his physical key. It still worked, and stepped into a house that no longer felt like home. Inside, the temperature was off, the lights hummed low, different than before. Some were auto-brightened, others dimmed. The scent of cedar from his living room candles was gone. The little details, the ones you don't notice until they're wrong, they were all off. His sanctuary had been touched, altered, by unseen hands. In the kitchen, he checked the panel for the smart system. A new interface stared back. Different layout, different branding. It had been updated, without his consent, changed while he was gone. The whispers began in his mind. Who had access? Why wasn't he alerted? How did the HOA not say anything? Or were they involved? He called Lucille, meeting the grounding of her voice. "Ma," he said, "something's off." "I know," she said. "I heard something on the scanner today. Said they had a call about a trespasser at your address." He didn't speak for a moment. "They were talking about me," he finally said. "I know," she whispered. "I knew at the moment they said big male on premises. You okay, baby?" "Not sure yet." "Then come home," she said. "Real home." But Shaq shook his head slowly. "No, not yet. I need to know what this is. I need to feel it before I fix it." He walked through the halls, each step echoing louder than it should have. Every corner carried a silence that didn't feel his. He stopped at the trophy room, pictures of him with kids, at charity events, standing in front of schools he helped rebuild, and still, a stranger in his own frame. Outside, the wind finally blew. Trees rustled like they had something to say. Shaq walked back to the front door, stood in the threshold, and stared past the gates. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. But something was coming, and this time, he'd be watching them back. He opened the blinds in his office. Nothing yet. The street was still, lined with palm shadows and trimmed silence. But it felt like the kind of quiet that sits before a storm arrives. Not rain, but a reckoning. "Thanks, Ma," he said, then paused. "Stay by the phone." Within minutes they came. It wasn't sirens. Nothing loud or dramatic. No lights. Just 3 squad cars sliding into place like chess pieces. Black and white shadows in the midday sun. Their presence didn't disrupt the street. It coated it, like paint on glass. Shaq stepped onto his porch, arms folded loosely, heart calm but alert. He wasn't new to being watched. But this was different. This wasn't the price of fame. This was the weight of being seen as a threat. Not a man, not a name, just a shape that didn't belong. 3 officers exited the vehicles. 2 men, 1 woman. They didn't unholster weapons, but their hands hovered too close to them, not drawn, just ready. Their steps were casual but calculated. The lead officer, a square-jawed man with sandy hair and a badge that read Hollis, spoke first. "Afternoon," he said. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. "We received a call about a possible trespassing situation," Hollis continued. "Said someone was seen on the property who didn't match the resident's owner profile." Shaq gave him a long, even look. "You mean me?" "Well, sir, we're just responding to the report," Hollis said, voice low and bureaucratic. "You mind telling us what you're doing here?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You know who I am." The female officer glanced at her partner. but none of them acknowledged the statement. They just stood there, waiting, pretending like this was about facts, about procedure. But it wasn't. It was about narrative. And in their narrative, he was out of place. I live here, Shaq said, slowly pulling out his wallet. I've lived here for 6 years. Do you have proof of ownership on you? The second male officer asked. His voice was neutral, practiced, but the edge was there. Shaq held up his license. The address matched the one etched in granite at the foot of his driveway. Still, Hollis shook his head slightly. Driver's license is a start, but it doesn't verify residency. Just confirms an ID. Anyone could use a fake. Shaq laughed once, humorless. A fake ID of me? No answer. No smile. Just 3 officers, looking at a 6'11" black man, like he might be a risk they hadn't calculated for properly. Lucille's words echoed in his head. This ain't right. He took a step down from the porch. Not fast, not dramatic, just a single, deliberate movement. What exactly did the call say, he asked. Hollis shrugged. Didn't get details. Just that someone was seen around the property who didn't look like he belonged. We have to take that seriously. Shaq leaned slightly forward. And what part of me didn't look like I belonged? My face? My skin? For the first time the woman officer blinked, faltered slightly. Hollis cleared his throat. Sir, we're not here to argue politics. We're just trying to do our jobs. And your job involves assuming the only black man on the block doesn't belong in his own house. Another pause. I don't want a scene, Shaq added. But let's not pretend this is just about a call. You didn't ask if I was okay. You didn't check if something had been broken into. You came looking for a suspect. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. But the quiet intensity in his words pressed into the space like a heavy fog. Not anger. Truth. Hollis glanced down at a tablet in his hand, fingers moving across it. System says deed is in the name of a corporate entity. O'Neal Holdings LLC. That's my business, Shaq said. Do you have paperwork on site to confirm that? Shaq stared. You walked onto my property based on a vague report, and now want me to prove I'm not a criminal? It's protocol. No, it's profiling. Tension wrapped the air tight. The silence between them became a fourth presence, louder than sirens, sharper than any order. Hollis shifted uncomfortably. We're going to have to file a report, he said finally. Nothing formal, just documentation in case the caller follows up. I want a copy of that report, Shaq said. Name, badge numbers, timestamps. I want it all. Hollis nodded. Of course. Shaq stepped back toward the porch. Then write fast, because next time you show up, I'll have every media outlet in Atlanta waiting here to watch how you treat people like me. The threat wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the truth spoken with the weight of someone who had always had to carry it. Eventually the officers left, driving off with the same eerie calm they arrived in, but they didn't take the feeling with them. That stayed. Settled into the porch, the sidewalk, the air. Shaq went inside and sat down on the edge of his grand piano bench. Hands folded, elbows resting on knees. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a stage, and he had been made into a performance, one that could be recast at any moment by someone who didn't like what they saw. He called Lucille back. They came, he said. What happened? They asked if I lived here. Wanted proof. Didn't believe the ID. Even questioned my business name. Lucille was quiet for a long time. Then, you okay? I will be, he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. What are you going to do? Shaq looked at the door, the cameras, the subtle violations. I'm going to find out who called, and I'm going to find out why. Lucille didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was a mother's nod, the kind that doesn't agree but understands. After they hung up, Shaq sat in the silence. This time, it wasn't the quiet of suspicion. It was the quiet before action. The system hadn't failed him. It had revealed itself. He stood up, walked to the back of the house, and opened the cabinet where the old router was stored. His fingers moved to a hidden panel beneath it. Something installed when the house was built, known only to him and one technician. A small light blinked red. Backup data. He pulled out the hard drive and plugged it into his laptop. Maybe the new system had overridden the house, but the house remembered, and Shaq was ready to listen. Because, whatever this was, it wasn't just a call. It was a message. And now, he was going to answer it. The backup drive from the night before had confirmed it. Multiple systems had been overridden, His original network had been rerouted, replaced without alert. The data showed pings from unfamiliar IPs, access granted remotely to admin levels, overrides that required authority. But the question wasn't just how, it was who, and more importantly, why now? As he stood from his seat and walked toward the hallway, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered anyway. Mr. O'Neal? The voice on the line was calm, crisp. Speaking. This is Officer Denton, from Cobb County PD. I'd appreciate it if you had a moment to speak in person. We're outside. Shaq turned slowly, toward the front window. Sure enough, a black unmarked cruiser sat just beyond the gate. Denton was leaning on the passenger side door, sunglasses resting in one hand, the other tucked in his belt loop. Not aggressive, not formal, just waiting. Shaq stepped out a moment later, wearing a plain dark tee, athletic pants and sneakers. No jewelry, no flash, just himself, pared down to what mattered, a man who was done being misread. Denton smiled as he approached, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth, just teeth and posture. His eyes didn't change, they didn't crinkle, they didn't see. Appreciate you coming out, he said. Wasn't sure if you'd answer. I live here, Shaq replied plainly. Why wouldn't I? Right. Of course. Denton's smile widened slightly, then vanished altogether. Mind if we talk inside? I mind, Shaq said. We can talk right here. Denton gave a small nod, like he'd expected it. Fair enough. We're following up on yesterday's report. Not just the call about trespassing, but some recent complaints filed with the neighborhood HOA. There's concern about unusual activity on your property. Cameras, systems being installed outside of regulation, possible zoning issues. Shaq raised an eyebrow. You get involved in zoning now? Denton shrugged. When public safety's involved, it all blends together, especially in tight-knit communities. Shaq crossed his arms, watching him closely. There was something too rehearsed in the way Denton spoke, like he'd said it a dozen times before, but this wasn't just about language. It was about layering, about power disguised as courtesy. Denton continued, I'd like you to come down to the station. Just to clarify a few things. Shouldn't take long. Shaq tilted his head. Am I under investigation? Not formally. Am I being detained? No. Then I'll stay here. There was a pause. Denton smiled again. That same flat, professional smile. I think it's in your best interest to cooperate, Mr. O'Neal. Coming in voluntarily looks better than being asked to. Shaq held his ground, voice even. I'm not the one that needs to look better. Denton's eyes flicked for a moment. Just a moment before he took a breath and shifted his stance. I understand this might feel like targeting, but our concern is making sure everything lines up legally. Ownership, access, property rights. It's not personal, it's protocol. Shaq didn't blink. And what if the protocol is built to feel personal? That silenced Denton for the briefest beat. His face didn't change, but the tempo of the moment slowed. That's when Shaq realized Denton was measuring him. Not just his words, but his tone, his restraint, looking for something to twist. You've had a lot of success, Mr. O'Neal, Denton finally said. A lot of eyes on you. With that kind of visibility comes responsibility. Public figures set a tone for their communities. And when things start to change, people know. Shaq narrowed his gaze. And what exactly do you think is changing here? People feel unsettled. When things expand too fast, some folks feel like the ground's shifting under their feet. Change makes people nervous. So you come here to what, calm the nerves? Or remind me who controls the ground? Denton gave a low chuckle, but there was nothing funny in it. I think you're reading too much into this. Shaq stepped forward slightly, closing the distance just enough to shift the temperature. No, I think you're saying too little. They stood there for a long moment. The air buzzed faintly with tension, silent but pointed. Denton adjusted his cuffs, breaking the eye contact. I'll leave my card, he said, reaching into his front pocket. If anything comes up, or if you change your mind, give me a call. Shaq didn't take the card. Denton placed it on the ledge by the gate, the way someone might place a business flyer, impersonal, transactional. His movements stayed measured, calm. But there was a tightness behind his professionalism, like a man used to being obeyed, now met with stillness he couldn't bend. As he turned to leave, Denton added casually, oh, and one more thing. You might want to check the zoning laws for structures over a certain height. New installations can require special permits. Just trying to help you stay ahead of any red tape. Shaq said nothing. He simply watched as Denton stepped into his cruiser and drove off, his figure shrinking behind tinted windows. Back inside, the silence returned, but now it had corners, edges. Shaq picked up the card Denton left and stared at it. No badge number on the front, just a name, phone, department logo. The back was blank, like the man himself, official on the outside, empty beneath. He walked into his study and opened his laptop, pulled up property records, HOA documentation. Everything had been tight. He had lawyers for that, but still, he knew what Denton was implying. They were going to make the rules bend against him. Use process as punishment. He tapped into the home network. The access logs from the previous day were incomplete. Sections of code were rewritten, erased. Whoever had overridden the system had done so with precision. This wasn't amateur tampering. This was surgical, authorized, and it had the fingerprints of someone who thought they couldn't be traced. As the hours passed, Shaq stayed focused. He moved through layers of digital data, like a man tracing footfalls in sand. Every time he found a lid, it forked into more questions. Every trail led back to permissions that shouldn't exist, until finally, one name surfaced buried in an IP registry. Denton. Not the same spelling. A variation. DNT Security Consulting LLC. A private firm, subcontracted through the HOA's legal branch for residential oversight. Not a public job. Not a police initiative. A side business, registered under a shell corporation in a nearby city. And that's when it clicked. Denton wasn't just a cop. He was a businessman. One with reach. The cameras. The unauthorized installations. The sudden change in surveillance patterns. It wasn't just intimidation. It was territory control. Denton had a stake in the privatization of the neighborhood's surveillance grid. The more problems that were reported, the more HOA contracts shifted to his firm. And what better way to escalate neighborhood fear than a suspicious presence in the form of someone who looks like he doesn't belong? Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't just being profiled. He was being monetized. This wasn't about race alone. This was about profit, about maintaining control through quiet pressure, through code words and policy, through fake concern and professional smiles. The pieces weren't falling apart. They were falling into place. He opened a secure folder and started drafting a memo. Not to the police, not to the HOA, to his media team, his publicist, his legal counsel. If they wanted this to be quiet, they'd chosen the wrong man. But he wouldn't go loud yet. No, he'd go deeper. Expose every layer. He closed the laptop and walked into the hallway, past the walls filled with photos. Not of him dunking, not of championships, but of family, kids from shelters, smiling students with scholarships, people whose lives had changed because he believed in showing up. This house wasn't just his residence, it was his stand. And now it was war. A quiet war. One fought not with fists but with facts. And Shaq was just getting started. He closed the laptop and stood, hands clenched for just a moment before releasing the tension. He walked through the house again, this time seeing it with new eyes, not as a home but as a battleground. Every window was a potential lens, every door, a manipulated threshold, but he refused to let it change him. As he entered the living room, his gaze fell on a picture of Namara, taken on her 16th birthday. She was smiling, standing beside him in front of this very house. It had been a day filled with joy, family, and laughter. The kind of day people like Wynn could never understand, not because they weren't allowed in, but because they didn't want to belong to something they couldn't control. Shaq sat on the couch, letting the moment settle. Then he grabbed his phone and made a call. "Braden," he said when his lawyer answered. "You got a minute? For you? Always. I need to run a name by you. Marshall Wynn. I want to know what he's attached to in the state. Companies, properties, holdings, anything public, and anything we can dig for behind the curtain." There was a pause. "We looking at a lawsuit?" "Not yet," Shaq replied. "We're looking at intent." After the call ended, he drafted a short email to his cybersecurity contact. He didn't ask for an investigation. He sent the files. Let the evidence speak first. Outside, dusk began to settle. The sky turned a shade of deep orange, casting long shadows across the lawn. And somewhere in those shadows, Shaq knew someone was watching. Whether through a screen or a set of binoculars, he didn't care, because now he was watching them back. He walked to the back patio, where the breeze carried hints of honeysuckle and distant laughter from a neighbor's cookout. That normalcy, that peace, it was worth protecting, not by retreating, but by exposing. The camera mounted on the far side of the patio made a soft mechanical click as it turned. Shaq stared directly into it, and for the first time, smiled. The Wheatwood Estates Community Clubhouse looked like a country club's cousin. Polished oak panels, polished floors, polished faces. Shaq had only attended a handful of HOA meetings since moving in, mostly for courtesy. He donated to their seasonal drives, funded the park remodel last year, and even paid out of pocket to fix the busted community gate after a summer storm. But today the room felt colder, like he'd stepped into a theater built not for inclusion, but for performance, and he wasn't cast as the star this time. Rows of white folding chairs were arranged in clean, silent lines, and the neighbors filled them with an almost reverent order. There were nods, murmured hellos, but no handshakes, no genuine warmth. Even the cookies on the refreshments table looked nervous. Shaq's presence alone seemed to bend the air slightly. Some looked at him, others looked past him, as though if they didn't make direct contact, he might somehow disappear. The only visible welcome came from a nod by an older black couple in the back. Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, longtime residents who'd warned him months ago to keep your papers in order around here. He hadn't known then how literal that advice was. At the front stood Carly Monroe, president of the HOA, all perfect posture and practiced composure. She wore a coral blazer and a smile that was somehow both warm and cold at once. Her eyes scanned the room like a librarian monitoring noise levels, then landed on Shaq. A brief pause, a pinched curve of the lips, and then the meeting began. "Good evening, neighbors," she said with a voice that dripped syrup but held steel underneath. "Let's begin with our commitment to preserving the values and aesthetic integrity of our beautiful community." There was a soft murmur of agreement across the room. Shaq remained still, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. "We've had a few reports," Carly continued, flipping through a folder with fingers that moved too confidently for coincidence, regarding recent changes made to properties without formal HOA review. Some of these changes include surveillance upgrades, exterior lighting additions, and perimeter modifications. Shaq felt the room tilt slightly, not in motion but in tone. Every eye wasn't on him, but every eye was aware of him. He knew how this worked. It wasn't about naming names. It was about shaping perception. "We remind all residents," Carly went on, "that unauthorized alterations are subject to review and may lead to citations or formal complaints filed with county zoning boards. This is not punitive, it's procedural. It ensures we all live in harmony with our shared standards." Shaq raised his hand, not to disrupt, but to engage. Carly smiled thinly and nodded. "Mr. O'Neal." He stood, tall and steady. "Just a quick clarification," he said calmly. "Were any of those reports specific to my address?" A few heads turned. Some neighbors shifted in their seats. Carly shook her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "We don't discuss individual cases publicly, Mr. O'Neal. We speak in general terms to preserve privacy. But the only property with new surveillance equipment is mine," Shaq replied. "And we all know it. So if we're talking about community, let's be honest about who's being targeted." Carly's smile didn't move. "No one is being targeted, sir." "Then let's put it in writing," Shaq said. "Let's vote to review all properties equally. Random inspections. No selective enforcement." A pause. Carly blinked, then gave a gracious nod. "We'll add that to the agenda for our next session. Tonight, let's stay on track." The tension in the room was subtle, but it wrapped around the walls like fog. Shaq sat down again, heart steady, but the weight of it all pressed harder now. This wasn't just coded language. It was erasure masked as maintenance. They weren't trying to remove him physically. They were rewriting the narrative around him. One citation, one whispered complaint, one formality at a time. The meeting dragged on with talk about landscaping violations, noise complaints, and mailbox uniformity. But the undertone was crystal clear. This wasn't about preserving aesthetics. It was about preserving comfort zones. And he didn't fit the design. After the meeting, as neighbors dispersed in clusters, Carly approached him with the kind of walk that looked polite but moved like strategy. "I hope you understand," she said, smiling. "We just want to keep things running smoothly. You've made quite a home here." Shaq looked her dead in the eyes. "I built that home. Not just with money, with presence, with care. I've done more for this neighborhood, in a year than some people have in a decade. Of course, she replied, tone flawless. And that's appreciated. But rules matter, Mr. O'Neal. No one is above them. I agree, he said. But no one should be beneath them either. That made her blink just once. Then her smile flickered into something tighter. I assume you'll be consulting with your lawyer again? She asked. Shaq didn't flinch. Already did. And just so you know, some of your language tonight, already flagged for review. Let's not pretend protocol hides intent. Her voice dropped a degree. We're not the enemy here. No, Shaq said, stepping past her. But you're definitely not the ally either. As he left the clubhouse, the air outside felt heavy. Not with weather, but with weight. The kind that builds when every polite nod carries a double meaning. When every community concern is a carefully disguised insult. He'd seen it before. In locker rooms. In boardrooms. In newsrooms. Now he was seeing it in neighborhood meetings. What shook him wasn't the subtle racism. It was how comfortable people were with it. How easily it slipped into policy. How effortlessly it dressed itself in concern. And how often it worked because it made the target look like the aggressor if they dared to name it. The next morning, a letter slid into his mailbox. No postage. No return address. Just a folded sheet of white paper. Inside, typed in clean font. Please be advised that non-conforming fixtures on the exterior of your property must be brought into compliance within 30 days. Failure to do so may result in fines, liens, or additional review by county authorities. This is your final notice. Shaq read it 3 times. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't even angry. Just certain. The mask was fully off now. He placed the letter next to the evidence files he was building, alongside system access logs, digital traces, and screenshots of every interaction, because this wasn't about one man standing alone. It was about exposing an entire structure that operated in shadows and smiled while doing it. Later that afternoon, he called Lucille. They're going after the house next, he told her. On paper. I figured they would, she said. That's how they do it. Make you so uncomfortable you leave before they have to push. I'm not leaving. Then stay loud, baby. Stay sharp. You got more than fists. Shaq hung up with her words tucked into his chest like armor. By evening, he had his legal team drafting formal counterclaims against selective enforcement. Braden was working on a restraining order to halt any forced structural changes pending investigation. His tech team was creating a private server for whistleblower submission, and quietly he began reaching out to other residents. Those who'd once stayed silent but whose homes bore the same signs of manipulation. Because one thing was becoming clear. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a pattern. And Shaq O'Neal didn't play defense when the game turned dirty. His voice cracked just slightly. And he caught it, held it in his throat like a man swallowing heat. I'm sorry, Mira said softly. You always taught me not to back down, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it alone. Shaq swallowed. I know. Just had to call. Had to let you hear it from me. I love you, she said. I love you more. They hung up without another word. But the weight remained. That night, the garden stayed quiet. No wind stirred. The oak stood like a wounded sentinel, its message still visible, even in the moonlight. Shaq sat on the patio, hood over his head, not to hide but to contain himself. He'd faced hecklers, haters, opportunists, but this was different. This wasn't about basketball or celebrity. This was about identity, about space, about the slow erosion of dignity, masked as neighborhood regulation, and delivered now with carved hate. Lucille called as the stars began to break through the clouds. You okay? She asked. I'm here. I heard about what was found. Shaq exhaled. Did Braden tell you? No. I just know how this game plays. It escalates. The smiles fade. The gloves come off. And what's left is the truth they were hiding behind policies and polite language. It's not the first time I felt it, he said, but it's the first time it's made its way into the backyard. Lucille was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke with the clarity only a mother could carry. You need to bring the media in. Shaq didn't answer. You got receipts. You got facts. You got history. You've got the kind of name that doesn't just get headlines, it gets movement. Let them see that. Shaq stared out into the dark. Not yet. Why not? Because if I go loud now, they'll turn it into a circus. Say I'm trying to make something out of nothing. Stirring the pot, and the ones doing this, they'll back off for a moment, change their tactics, maybe even vanish. I need them to stay bold. I need them to think I'm still just a target. Then I'll strike. Lucille sighed. You sound like your father. Always played the long game. Shaq smiled faintly. Didn't always work for him. No. But it gave him time to make the right move. They stayed on the phone for a while, not talking strategy, not even naming names, just breathing together, holding space. When they hung up, Shaq walked back into the yard with a flashlight and took photos of the carving high-res, time-stamped. He saved them to 3 different drives, one in the cloud, one encrypted, one offline. Then he lit the citronella torches around the garden's border and sat down by the stone bench beside the pond. He wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't bowing, and he wasn't broadcasting. Not yet. This was personal. This was his line in the soil. Let the quiet build. Let the enemy keep thinking they had the upper hand. He wasn't broken, but he was bruised. And he was done pretending the wound wasn't deep. It started with a knock that wasn't really a knock, more like a flick of obligation. A courier, stiff in posture and clipped in tone, handed Shaq a manila envelope without eye contact. From the county assessor's office, he said, before walking back down the long driveway without another word. Shaq stood there, the air humid around him, envelope in hand, pulse slowing as he felt a shift coming, one he hadn't yet named, but already understood. Something was off. He walked inside, peeled the seal back, and pulled out 3 pages. The first was titled Notice of Ownership Dispute, parcel N34W0721. The second was a formal request for a property hearing, citing title irregularities and conflicting deed claims. The third, a legal copy of a deed. It didn't have his name on it. It had Marshall Wynn's. Shaq read it 3 times, then once more out loud, as if hearing it would somehow correct what his eyes were telling him. But the ink didn't change. The dates didn't shift. This was a valid filing, signed, stamped, filed 2 days ago. The name of the grantee, Wynn Residential Holdings, LLC. The notary seal was real. The document looked official because it was official on record now, and legally disputing his ownership of the home he built, the garden he curated, the walls that carried his family's breath. He didn't sit down. He didn't even blink hard. He picked up his phone and called Braden Cole. I need you at the house, Shaq said flatly. Braden didn't ask why. Be there in 20. By the time Braden arrived, Shaq had pulled every physical document he had from his home safe. Title insurance, the original deed, the closing paperwork, transfer confirmations, and a signed letter from the title company at the time of purchase. Everything lined up, on his end. Braden flipped through it methodically. Okay, he said, tone steady, lawyer mode, engaged. Now show me what came in. Shaq handed him the envelope. Braden scanned the pages in silence, then exhaled through his teeth. They used a quitclaim deed. What's that mean? It means someone filed a claim saying you transferred ownership willingly. There's no warranty, no background verification, just a signed document that says you handed it over. I never signed anything. I know, but all it takes is one bad notary, one shady witness, and a courthouse clerk that doesn't double-check because they're overworked. They slip it in, it gets scanned, and legally, the system pauses everything tied to your claim until the dispute's resolved. So I don't own my house? Shaq asked, the words tasting like betrayal.
Braden looked up. Right now, not officially. Until the hearing, it's frozen.
Shaq turned and stared out the window. The garden swayed slightly in the breeze. The carved tree stood tall in the corner. But something about the property felt different now, like the ground itself had shifted under his feet. They're coming at me sideways, he said. Not with force, with paperwork. This isn't an accident, Braden said. This is a hostile maneuver. Shaq nodded slowly. And it's not about the house.
No, Braden confirmed.
It's about humiliation, discredit. It's about pushing you to react, make a mistake. They want you to lose your cool, go public too early, muddy the waters. But this is engineered. He turned from the window. They've got money behind them. Access. This isn't just win. Could be a network. Could be old money that doesn't want you here. Could be someone looking to push you out and flip this house at a premium. You'd be amazed what kind of games people play when you threaten their illusion of control. Shaq's hands curled into fists at his sides. Not out of rage. Out of focus. He had grown up in rooms full of noise. He'd played through pressure, loss, injury, and slander. But this was different. This was about rewriting truth, making him disappear on paper, even as he stood in the foyer of his own home. What's our next move? He asked. First, we challenge the deed. That'll take time. County's slow but will demand a hearing. Second, I'll push for a forensic document analysis, prove that signature isn't yours. Third, we need to get ahead of this with title insurance. That policy will fight on our behalf too. But Shaq caught the hesitation. But what? They're trying to bury you in process. Legal fatigue, death by 1,000 filings. If they delay this long enough, you won't just be fighting for your house. You'll be defending your credibility. That's the real play. The idea settled deep. Shaq didn't just feel invaded. He felt erased. He walked to the living room, picked up one of the framed photos from the mantel. Mamara and Lucille, standing under the front archway, arms raised, laughing, proud. He held it for a long moment. They think I won't fight because I'm quiet, he said. Because I haven't gone to the media. Because I haven't named names. Braden nodded. But you're not quiet. You're precise. Shaq set the frame down. They want me to crack. Make a move before I know the board. But this is chess, not checkers, Braden replied. Shaq smirked faintly. Then it's time to set my pieces. That night, he worked until dawn. He had his tech team scan every file associated with Wynn Residential. Digging deeper, they uncovered LLCs stacked like Russian dolls, each pointing to the next, until finally tracing one back to a shell corporation, registered to a consulting group known for zoning manipulation and title flipping. The same group had been cited in another state for deed fraud. It was systemic. It was designed to happen without anyone noticing. And it had happened here, to him. He began documenting every interaction, every visitor, every phone call. He set up a physical journal next to the door and logged timestamps like a guard on post. This wasn't paranoia. It was evidence. And when he couldn't sleep, he'd walk the edges of the garden, fingers grazing the leaves, eyes scanning the fences, not to watch for enemies, but to remind himself that roots didn't move just because wind blew. He spoke to Lucille again the next morning. They're trying to wipe me from the books, he said. They can't erase a man who's carved his name in stone, she told him. He believed her. But now, he was going to make sure they remembered why it was carved in the first place. Then another voice joined in, gravelly, smug. And if we stage a little uncertainty about ownership, value goes down. We move in, flip it, push a new family in by fall. Shaq froze. He rewound the clip, replayed it. This wasn't just strategy. This was conspiracy. He opened the next file. This time the footage had video too. Grainy black and white, but enough to make out faces. They were standing in his backyard, just out of range of the obvious cameras. 3 of them. Officer Denton, Carly Monroe, Marshall Wynn. Denton was pacing, hands on his hips. The man's got influence. You hit him head on, it'll backfire, Carly responded. Arms folded, voice stiff with condescension. He's not invincible. He just thinks he is because people like him usually don't get pushed back. We make it procedural. Play the long game. Wynn leaned against the garden wall, grinning. Besides, the neighborhood's ready. They're tired of the noise. The parties. The visitors. They just won't say it out loud. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the blood draining from his face. Noise? Parties? He hadn't hosted more than a cookout since moving in. Visitors? His family? His team? A couple of kids he mentored on weekends. This wasn't about disruption. This was about perception. They didn't see him as a neighbor. They saw him as a blemish on the carefully crafted image of Whitwood Estates. And now he had proof they were coordinating an effort to erase him. Not with threats, but with legal sabotage and manufactured reputation decay. He opened more files, each one another nail in the coffin of their credibility. Discussions about the fake deed transfer. A segment where Denton described how to use routine patrols to intimidate him. Carly suggesting they stage an HOA complaint over landscape changes. Marshall laughing about how celebrity egos crack faster under pressure than most. Shaq's chest tightened, not with rage but with something deeper. Violation. Not just of his property, but of his personhood. Of trust. He sat in silence, letting the weight of the evidence settle around him. Then he picked up the phone and called Braden. I need you at the house. Again. Braden arrived. An hour later. Shaq didn't waste time with pleasantries. He played the videos, one by one. By the 3rd clip, Braden had stopped taking notes. By the 5th, his jaw had tightened. This isn't just negligence, Braden said. This is premeditated fraud, harassment, Abuse of power. Shaq didn't respond. He was staring at the paused screen. Win mid-laugh. Denton checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. I can go public, Braden said. Now. We've got enough to bury all three of them. File complaints, drop press releases, and set up a hearing request with the state attorney's office. Shaq rubbed his face, then stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the front yard. Two kids on bikes rode past, laughing. A woman jogged by with earbuds. It all looked so normal. Still. Not yet, he said. Braden turned. Why? Because I want to know how far they're willing to go. This proves what they've done, but not why. I want the whole network. Who's funding them? Who's benefiting from this if I get pushed out? You want to bait them, Braden said. I want them to feel like they're winning, Shaq replied, until they're too deep to dig out. They spent the next hour transferring the files onto encrypted drives, documenting chain of custody, and preparing a digital archive that could be delivered to multiple outlets, if and when the moment was right. That evening, Shaq sat in his living room. Lights dimmed, the weight of everything pressing against the silence. Niamara called. He told her nothing, not yet. Lucille left a voicemail asking if he'd thought about bringing in media. He hadn't returned her call yet. This wasn't about headlines, it was about precision. He stepped outside, walking the perimeter of the property. This time he didn't feel exposed. He felt armed. He passed the tree with the carved message. It was still there, its grooves darker now under the moonlight. But it no longer rattled him. It felt like a relic from before he knew the truth. As he circled toward the side gate, he noticed something faint tire marks leading away from the curb. A light scuff on the corner of the pavement. He bent down and touched the edge. Still warm. Someone had been watching. Maybe Win. Maybe Denton. Let them watch, he thought. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the quiet cul-de-sac. Because now, he wasn't just waiting. He was setting the trap. The invitation had gone out quietly, worded with soft intention and warm neutrality. Community conversation, Whitwood Estates Town Hall. Let's talk progress. No banners, no capital letters screaming urgency. Just an evening gathering framed as bridge building. A chance to reset, to heal. A performance of peace, designed by the one man who knew there was a war underneath the manicured lawns. Shaq stood in the back of the community center as folding chairs filled slowly. Residents filed in, murmuring in soft tones, cups of lukewarm coffee in hand, pastries on napkins. They were used to seeing him on TV, in commercials, in games long won. But seeing him here, shoulders squared, eyes calm but sharp, felt different. It was like watching a mountain lean forward. At the front sat two chairs reserved for special guests. One was already occupied by Marshall Wynn, dressed down in a slate blazer, casual slacks, and that same smug grin worn like armor. The other remained empty for now. Carly Monroe hadn't shown. But Shaq knew Denton would. A man like him couldn't resist being in control of a room, even when he didn't know he'd already lost it. Shaq waited until the room was full, then stepped onto the small platform that served as a stage. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, the hush grow deeper. No microphone, no podium, just his presence. I appreciate y'all showing up, he began, his voice steady, filling the room without effort. I know community meetings aren't the most exciting way to spend a Thursday night, but tonight's not about new mailboxes or parking permits. A few polite chuckles rippled, then faded. It's about what we allow to live under the surface. Murmurs, shifts in posture, eyes narrowing. People knew something was coming. See, I moved here because I believed this neighborhood represented something. Safety, integrity, respect. I thought the gates were built to protect us, not to divide us. He let that land, then continued. But over the last few months, I've learned those gates don't just keep people out. They keep certain truths from getting in. And the truth is, no matter how much you give, how much you've earned, how many kids you feed, or schools you build, some people still won't see you as someone who belongs. Denton walked in then, cool and calculated, sliding into the empty chair next to Wynn with a nod. Shaq didn't acknowledge him. He raised a small remote, and clicked. The projector behind him blinked to life. A video began to play. The audio filled the room. Denton's voice, unmistakable. It's not about getting him arrested. It's about applying pressure. Gasps. A few whispers turned into stunned silence as the next voices followed. Carly Monroe discussing procedural sabotage, and finally Wynn, chuckling about flipping Shaq's estate after pushing him out. The footage continued for 5 minutes, unedited, undeniable. By the time it ended, the room felt scorched. No one touched their coffee. The air buzzed not with noise, but electricity. Eyes darted to Denton and Wynn. Wynn's smirk had cracked. His eyes flicked to the exits. He stood slowly, muttering something under his breath before striding out, head down, face red. No words. No denial. Denton remained seated. Shaq stepped down from the platform, walking slowly until he stood right in front of him. "You want to explain that?" he asked, calm as still water. Denton looked up, smile returning like a trickle of smoke. "Chain of custody," he said. "None of that holds in court. Could have been edited. Could have been fabricated." He leaned back in the chair, voice low and smug. "You can't prove when or how it was recorded. You'll drown in technicalities." Shaq didn't blink. "I don't need a courtroom. I needed this room." He turned to the crowd. "Y'all heard it. You felt it. That was real. That wasn't Hollywood. That was what's been living under the surface of this neighborhood, dressed up as policy, hiding behind procedure. You heard the plans. You heard the intent." Someone in the crowd stood. It was Mrs. Ellison. "This happened to the Carsons 2 years ago," she said, her voice trembling. "Young couple. Didn't last 6 months before they accidentally lost their lease. We thought it was a fluke, but now I know it wasn't." Another man stood. Then another. Voices rising, not in chaos, but in clarity. And still, Denton sat. Still, unmoved. Shaq looked at him one last time. "You smiled through every meeting. You called it community. But you were building a trap, not just for me, for anyone who didn't fit the mold you liked. You thought power would shield you, that procedure would protect you." He stepped back. "But I don't need a badge to be heard. I don't need a robe to be right. I brought the truth, the real kind. And now, we're not quiet anymore." The room erupted. Not in cheers, but with resolve. Neighbors began recording. Local reporters in the back pushed forward. The HOA board members who had stayed silent for months whispered urgently to one another, eyes wide with panic. Shaq stood tall, not with victory, but with purpose, because the tape had changed everything. But the work wasn't over. Denton might escape the room tonight, but he wouldn't escape the reckoning, not now that the lie had a voice. And Shaq? He didn't come to tear the system down in anger. He came to expose it in daylight. Just him, in front of his house. The very house they tried to take. Reporters lined the curb, microphones out, recorders blinking. The HOA board stood quietly off to the side, unsure whether to apologize or retreat. Lucille and Mara were there too, watching not as spectators, but as anchors. Then Denton arrived, still in uniform. No escort, just his own arrogance. He walked up slowly, eyes scanning the cameras, jaw locked as if he were preparing for a trial. He clearly expected confrontation, maybe another exposé, another public dismantling. Instead, Shaq walked toward him. No words, just a hand. Open, extended. The crowd held its breath. Denton blinked, confused. For a moment it looked like he wouldn't move. Then, out of instinct or maybe shame, he took the hand. A stiff grip, a muscle memory. And that's when Shaq spoke, low enough that only those close could hear. "I won't fight like you," he said. "I'll rebuild louder than you break." Denton didn't reply. Couldn't. The handshake ended in seconds, but the image would live far longer. Within days, the ripple effect began. The Georgia Attorney General opened a formal inquiry into Denton's off-duty surveillance contracts. A whistleblower inside the HOA confirmed Carly Monroe's direct involvement in suppressing housing applications and leveraging HOA policy for targeted discrimination. She resigned with a single statement: mistakes were made. But the biggest blow came when Marshall Wynn was arrested on charges of deed fraud, conspiracy to defraud homeowners, and tampering with property records. An audit of his real estate development firm uncovered similar incidents across 3 counties. He'd been replicating the same formula for years, using coded language and systemic tools to erase and replace. Now, he would answer for it. But for Shaq, none of that was the real win. The real win was the neighborhood. Weeks passed. The street began to change, not in its look, but in its tone. Neighbors who once nodded without speaking now stopped to talk. Conversations turned real. A community advisory board was formed, with representation that reflected more than just property values. Shaq funded a local youth mentorship center using the garden space in his own yard. And the tree with the carved threat? He didn't remove it. He planted another tree beside it, then placed a bench there. The two trees stood, side by side, one scarred, one new. A reminder that growth doesn't erase wounds. It grows next to them. One afternoon, Mamera sat with him on that bench. "They tried to write you out," she said. "They tried," Shaq nodded. "But now your name's written louder." He smiled. "Not my name," he said. "My choice. That's what they'll remember." And she knew exactly what he meant. Because the loudest thing in that whole storm was the quietest move. A handshake, held in strength, not surrender, and caught in history forever. It arrived on a Wednesday. No courier this time. No official seal. Just a standard white envelope. Slipped quietly into Shaq's mailbox between an energy bill and a flyer for a local wine tasting event. No return address. The handwriting on the front was clean, upright, and unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't printed. It wasn't typed. It was chosen. Shaq turned it over in his hands for a moment, sensing the weight of it, before ever opening it. There was no anticipation, no curiosity, just that quiet awareness that some letters weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to be read and remembered. He opened it inside, alone in his study, while the late afternoon sun slanted across the floorboards. The paper inside was a single sheet, cream-colored, slightly textured. At the top it read simply, "To Mr. O'Neal." He began reading. "Mr. O'Neal, by the time you read this I will no longer be the president of the Whitwood Estates Homeowners Association. My resignation was effective last week, though I'm sure the neighborhood will make that known with far more noise than when I first took the role. I debated writing you this letter. I imagined you'd toss it the moment you saw my name, and part of me wouldn't blame you if you did. But something kept pushing me to put this on paper, not because I expect forgiveness, but because I owe you the truth. Finally, I grew up in Dalton, Georgia, in a house where the dinner table was quiet but full of expectations. My parents didn't raise their voices. They raised their standards. And with those standards came subtle beliefs passed down like fine china, quiet, coded, and deadly in their comfort. I was taught without anyone ever using the words that neighborhoods were better when they looked a certain way, when the lawns were trimmed, when the colors stayed muted, when the people who moved in didn't disrupt the balance. We never talked about race, Mr. O'Neal. Not directly, but we talked about property value, about culture, about tradition. And I carried that with me when I moved to Whitwood, when I took that HOA role, when I smiled and welcomed you with my lips and braced myself with my spine. You came in with confidence, with pride, with presence, and I saw that as a threat, not because you did anything wrong, but because you did everything right. And it still made me uncomfortable. I didn't just let what happened to you unfold. I allowed it. I signed off on those citations. I encouraged those meetings. I stood beside men like Denton and Wynne, because they made me feel like I was preserving something. In truth, all I preserved was ignorance. The day of the town hall, when you stood in front of all of us and played that tape, I didn't just hear my voice. I saw it, the smallness in it, the cowardice dressed in policy. I saw a woman trying to keep her version of order by quietly pushing a man like you to the edge of comfort until he walked away. But you didn't walk away. You stood taller. You didn't shout. You showed. And that did something to me. The truth is, I never thought someone like you could belong here, because I didn't understand what belonging really meant. I thought it was about silence, about sameness, about a controlled picture that never changed. But you changed it. You brought something here that no landscaped hedge or HOA regulation ever could. Decency. You showed up when no one asked you to. You gave without demanding praise. You stayed even when we gave you every reason not to. And through all of it, you treated this place like home, even when we treated you like a stranger. That's on me. I won't pretend this letter fixes anything, and I know it doesn't absolve me. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. What I helped cover. What I refused to confront. What I was afraid to unlearn. This isn't a request for a response. It's a thank you for staying, for speaking, for not fighting fire with fire, even though you had every right. You didn't just raise the property value of this neighborhood in dollars. You raised it in decency. And we didn't deserve it. Not then. Maybe not now, But I hope one day, we will. Sincerely, Carly Monroe. Shaq finished reading, the letter resting loosely in his hands. He didn't move for a while, just sat there, letting the words live in the room with him, like a fog that didn't sting, but still clung. It wasn't redemption, not full, but it was real. The kind of honesty that cost something to write. That didn't come wrapped in excuse or self-protection. That wasn't delivered from a stage, or under pressure, or with cameras rolling. It came quietly, alone. And in that way it carried more weight than 1,000 statements could. Later that evening, he sat in the garden beneath the twin trees, the carved one, and the young one growing beside it. The wind moved gently through their branches, the kind of breeze that didn't sweep in with noise, but rearranged things slowly, softly. He didn't frame the letter. He didn't quote it online. He just folded it once, placed it in a drawer beside his daughter's birthday cards, and Lucille's handwritten recipes, and let it rest. Because some letters aren't meant to be displayed. They're meant to be remembered. Later that day, Lucille walked the halls beside him. She paused at the old dining room, now turned into a meeting space with a long reclaimed wood table surrounded by mixed chairs. Some new, some donated, each different, each with a story. You did this without making noise, she said, her voice half pride, half disbelief. No, Shaq replied softly. They made the noise. I just made space. She nodded. That's the kind of power they don't know how to fight. He looked around, his eyes softening. This house used to feel too big for one man. Now it finally fits. As the evening cooled, and the last cars pulled away, Shaq found himself walking the length of the hallway again. The sun dipped low, painting gold along the baseboards. He passed framed photographs lining the corridor. Images of the build process, of volunteers side by side with construction workers, of kids reading books under skylights, of neighbors smiling in spaces that once felt exclusive. Near the end of the hall hung a simple frame. Inside was a scan of the fake deed, the one filed by Marshall Wynne, now crossed out in bold red with the word void, stamped across it, signed by a judge. Beside it was a second frame, a photo of the town hall handshake, his open hand, Denton's stiff grip, and the entire neighborhood watching. Shaq stopped in front of it, stared for a long moment. Not because it glorified the moment, but because it froze the turning point, where power met restraint, where anger gave way to something more permanent, legacy. That night, Miora returned from college and walked the halls with her father. She took in the new layout, the shift in energy. When they reached the main stairwell, she leaned her head against his shoulder.
You never told me this was the plan, she said.
It wasn't, he admitted. It just became the only one that made sense. She nodded. You know, you could have sold this place, walked away, gone somewhere quieter. Yeah, he said. But that would have let them win. She looked at him. So what do you call this? He smiled, eyes gleaming in the low light. Winning different. As they turned the corner, he reached out and touched the wall lightly with his fingertips. You hear that? He said. She laughed. Hear what? He grinned. Nothing. That's peace. They both stood still for a moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of a home no longer built for isolation, but inclusion. Before heading upstairs, Shaq walked back to the garden. The two trees stood taller now. The scarred one hadn't healed. Its carving still visible, but the new one had grown strong beside it. Shaq stood between them, the wind brushing past like a low whisper. He didn't say much, just looked around, at the lights glowing in the windows, at the camera gently rotating at the end of the driveway, at the gate wide open, and finally, at the sky. Then in the softest tone, almost to himself, he whispered, "Still mine." If this story made you pause, good, because what happened to Shaq isn't fiction, it's reflection. Look around your own neighborhood. Ask who feels watched and who feels welcome. Sometimes the most powerful stand you can take is simply not looking away.